Let us explore the orchestra hands-on. Let's investigate what is in there by hearing them, actually, hearing of different ways of making music with them. We call such things articulations, and they are usually referred to with their Italian terminology. For instance, on my screen, you see an orchestral diagram. Now, I'm hoping that you recognize it. And below are some Italian words: spiccato, pizzicato, tremolo. We're going to find out about all of these using this plugin. This is by Spitfire Audio. It's a plugin which is made out of a sampled sound set from the BBC Symphony Orchestra. How such things are made is that you put the orchestra in a studio and record them meticulously. They would be, of course, performing basically only long notes which are recorded, edited, and then put into the sample to sound like a replica of the orchestra. This is by no means a very complicated software, and it's got some possibilities to further improve the sound, but there are much more comprehensive orchestral libraries out there. So for the pro audio person, this is a beginner's program. Let's take a look at our color-coded diagram here. First of all, you see the strings are coded with the green, and they are the most numerous of the entire orchestra. They are sort of the really blood and bone of the orchestra, and all the rest are the more colorful aspects, the skin, the hair, what actually defines that person visually. But within, we are all the same. We all have our skeleton. And you can't just think of any Western music not having a core string sound, really. So that said, let's take a closer look and see, besides the strings, we're going to also enjoy the woodwinds in their blues, the brass in their pink. The horns are here, they're not on the opposite side, but there are some alternative seating. So you might see the horns, for instance, right behind the violas sometimes. And there is the brass, of course. Within the orchestra, it can get very loud. Actually, some noise measurements were made under many circumstances around the world. It is an occupational hazard for orchestral players to lose their hearing because they are usually subjected to more than 90 decibels of sound levels. Therefore, they're advised to wear sometimes ear protectors, and especially if they're sitting, for instance, next to a particularly loud instrument, like some of the brass instruments you're going to hear. Well, sometimes you see plexiglass shields to protect the orchestra's rest of the members from the, overly powerful sound. So the COVID situation, of course, made more plexiglass panels necessary. The wind instruments can really, really project the breath into the hall. I mean, they're really pressuring the air in order to create those particular vibrations that the air is supposedly carrying. Therefore, it's not very convincing actually to just go to a concert in the COVID situation and see everybody in masks and the brass instruments just blaring their lungs out into the hall. Therefore, you're going to see a lot of plexiglass involved these days, I can tell you that. When you look at the diagram, you're going to see that the first violins and the second violins are not, in terms of size, proportionate, but this is usually not the case. The first violins usually consist of like 6 to 10 players. The second violins are in a comparable size, basically. They're not particularly less than the first violins, and they're perfectly capable of doing everything the first violinists are doing. Therefore, sometimes you're going to see, for instance, the second violins are playing the lead melody and the first violins are just doing some decorative things higher in the texture. So think of these as like two equivalent songbirds, two equivalent melodic instrument groups that can also be used, of course, for accompanimental textures. Well, the first violins actually have the task to control the rest of the string group, not the entire first violins, but the leader of the first violins. He or she is called a Concertmeister, and her task is to really gather the string group together and decide on articulations, for example, to exactly tell, for instance, are the group members playing the downstroke or the upstroke? Are they doing pizzicato in a particular way? So these need to be decided in advance, and it's not always the conductor's task to control such matters. So that's what is usually being done. So the first violins do sound lush and rich and melodious. Here beneath the screen, you're going to see the representation of a piano keyboard. The highlighted white keys are actually the range of that instrument, the usual range a trained composer would write for that instrument. Actually, for instance, the first violins can go using overtones, using harmonics, probably higher. But conventionally, to get that ensemble sound, to get that rich, thick, binded together string sound, that's the safe zone to stay. And physically, the lowest note on a violin is this. And physically, the lowest note on a violin is this one anyways. How you tune open strings of a violin is this. So these are your open strings, meaning that without touching the fretboard, these are the sounds that are going to come out from your strings, from your four strings of the violin. But of course, the orchestral violinists are not virtuosi, but they're really capable players. So they're expected to play beautiful long lines that particularly are actually quite high in the frequency range. So higher than, say, 1K or something. The other techniques, the spiccato just gives you, for instance, short and resonant chords, for instance. And pizzicato is what you do when you pluck the strings with your fingers. Another very frequently used technique is the tremolo, which actually is achieved by vibrating the bow rapidly on the string. This is particularly effective when you play high up in the range as a bit of color. Let's hear the violas. These guys are usually underrepresented. They are not given many melodic lines. Their main task is to accompanying chords, for instance, broken chords, or just lines that are somewhere subordinate in the texture. So difference between a violin and the viola is that the viola has thicker strings, it's bigger, it's got a more throaty, more chesty, more masculine sound than the violin. And well, it's not as lustrously bright as the violins. That's why it's somehow not used as a solo instrument. It's not as resonant, basically. If you look at the diagram here, you're going to see that the viola is somewhat lower than the violin. So it can go as down as here. The cello group is the favorite of many composers. I can think of many cello group solos in symphonic works because the cello has a very interesting quality. Whenever, for instance, it is given a solo, this group, their high tension and strength in terms of, sonic possibilities of a bigger body than the viola, but taut strings, unlike the double bass, give them a resonant quality that pierces the orchestra. So you can really write cello solos in rather crowded textures, basically. And they really sound very well when they're played pizzicato as well. The double bass. Best thing to say about it is that it's a big, clumsy instrument which doesn't really lend itself very well for soloistic playing. It is there to play especially plucked bass lines or bowed bass lines, repetitive music to highlight chords. It was a scandal, for instance, when Beethoven asked in his Fifth Symphony for the double bass group, doubling with the cellos, to play such a line. This is the lowest sounding instrument of the entire orchestra. The piano has still 3 tones lower than this, mind you. Let's take a look at the woodwinds. Actually, these are more like less numerous because, well, you don't really need as many soloists as you would need an ensemble. So there are more string players than woodwind players. When we start off with the smallest of them all, the smallest instrument of the orchestra, the piccolo flute, it is really not maybe a very representative example because it's just too high. Basically, the instrument is as big as a pencil, just like that, and it just doubles up what the flute is doing an octave higher. This is how it will sound. A more serious flute sound is, of course, the traverse flutes that we often use. These are actually in two. So there are some symphonies that ask for 4 flutists, but usually the regular number is 2, maybe 3. There are other versions of the flute, the alto or the bass flute. They sound soft and mysterious, especially in mid registers and lower registers. But in that part of the orchestra, there is usually the beefier, louder brass and string instruments. So it's seldom to have these given solos or something. You will have them in some works as specifically asked for, but they're not very frequent flutes actually. The oboe, this is one of the more mysterious instruments because it's not every day that you find a devoted oboe player. It's a difficult instrument, it's difficult to learn, and usually it is the first thing you would hear when you go to an orchestral concert. This is what the entire orchestra tunes to. The oboes come with the factory setting of a fixed A, so you can't change it. You can't alter the tuning of an oboe. So therefore you have it act as a cue for the rest of the orchestral players. They will all tune to this. The oboe is actually a relative of the bassoon, which is a lower sounding, a bass instrument, but it's got the same double reed mechanism as the oboe, and the sound is also reminiscent of the oboe. But the bassoon and its big brother, the contrabassoon, which is like an octave lower, actually have more associations, such as, for instance, sounding comical, and therefore are usually assigned these staccato passages. Finally, we have the clarinets, which are more recent than the other woodwind. They are invented somewhere in the 18th century, and they have found their final shape in 19th century. Being a slightly more modern instrument gives them the edge over, being a complete master of dynamics and timbre, uniform timbre throughout their range, a wider range than, for instance, the oboe, and beautiful tone quality. The brass are the loudest of orchestral instruments, especially the brass which are towards the right-hand side of this diagram. The horns are a curious pair. Usually there are at least 2 horns in your orchestra. There might be actually 4 for the classical and beyond, 4 horns became the standard. And they can do pretty much anything. They have a wide range. They have the capability to go blaring brass or very soft and subtle to accompany woodwind. A very colorful, very rich instrument. Horns can also go very loud and very bass. But the coolest thing is this blending capability. You can blend horns with woodwinds, you can blend horns with strings, and of course with other brass. The closest relative would be, I guess, the trombones. Usually you will have the horns binding the whole orchestra. Let's hear the brass a little bit more. Here's the trumpet. The tenor trombones, they blend very well with, for instance, the horns or fill up the under reaches of the trumpets. The bass trombones are usually coupled up with the tubas to fill up that low end. The tuba is the lowest, and it is really very strong, but it's not very agile. So usually what you do with it, you make it play actually bass lines, just maybe walking basses and such. It was a very popular instrument for walking marching bands, and because it's like 12 meters of tubing wrapped on top of itself and it's difficult to carry, it was made into this new version called the Xylophone. The inventor was an American instrument maker called Sousa, and all he did is to unravel the tuba and wrap it as a coil so that the bearer can wear it around their body while they're walking. Finally, we have our percussion. Within the percussion group are also included the harp and celesta here. The harp is capable of playing pretty much everything the piano can play, but it's not chromatic, it's diatonic. It's got a pedal mechanism to really, for instance, filter out unwanted keys that don't exist in the scale. And usually, therefore, it's used as an effects instrument to create ripples and beautiful sounding runs and such. or you can use the harp as a percussion, almost like a percussion instrument to augment some chords. The Celesta, on the other hand, is purely melodic, and it's at the very top end. It's got this beautiful sheen, this crystalline luster, which actually get to be the hallmark of some pieces such as Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. Now, what we mean by tuned percussion is percussion that give us a straightforward, discernible pitch. The most famous of these actually is the xylophone. It's got this characteristic sound which is bone-like usually. That's what it's compared to. And it's a keyboard thing. I mean, it's not played by a keyboard, but it's played by mallets. This is how it sounds like. Here's the Glockenspiel, which is almost toy-like, actually. Finally, the timpani. This is the to-go drum of the orchestra. It's loud, it's big, and it's still capable of producing pitch, actually. You heard a selection of other untuned percussion instruments that can be used in an orchestra. Actually, you can expand the list, and especially 20th century music really exploited the percussion instruments to a great extent. Thank you for watching. This is how you would reach me. I'm easy to find. All you need to remember is my name and where I work. So if you want to have more of such videos, please remember to subscribe to my channel and give me some feedback about what to produce about. I hope you have learned more about the orchestra and just maybe got a glimpse into this magical world of classical music. See you in the next video.